Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. In a break from our normal digest of current affairs, we're going to take a step back into recent history and look at code breaking during the Second World War. Now, from the outset, I have to say I'm not one for another tale of how the Brits won the war, but this story is a little different. It tells the German side of things, and let me say from the outset, the glory is not all ours. We have with us Christian Jennings, historian, a former foreign correspondent, whose most recent book is called The Third Reich is Listening. Hello and welcome, Christian.
Thanks very much, Nick.
Here's the book, just in front of me here. I'm very glad to have you with us. I guess we should start with what everyone knows, the stories of Bletchley Park, Alan Turing, the wonders of Allied intelligence and the breaking of the Enigma code. It's a great story. But I guess the question is, what's wrong with it?
It's a fantastic story. It's a fantastic story of secrecy, of success, of operational influence. There's nothing wrong with the story. It's a fabulous story. It's just half the story. And the other half of the story lies at the other side of the English Channel in Germany. What were the Germans up to during and before the Second World War when it came to cryptanalysis, code breaking and code making? Whose codes were they cracking? What were they up to themselves?
You've done a huge amount of research, and amazingly, so much of this German intelligence work is still kept in archives across Europe. But can you start by telling us how the Allies realized that the Germans were actually doing a better job than many people thought?
Well, the Allies assumed that what they were doing themselves would be done by other people. And when they started work on looking into capturing and breaking into the German cryptanalytical systems encrypted on the Enigma machine, they realized they were up against an adversary whose advances and technology in code making and code breaking were astounding. It began in the First World War, though, when at the beginning of the First World War, the Germans, who then relied upon code books, where a message for any given signal would be encrypted using a series of either letter codes, number codes, groups of letters, groups of numbers from a given code book, which was like a dictionary where you would have thousands of groups of four-figure numbers in a code book, each one of which represented the word for battleship, torpedo, starboard, port, into the attack, whatever. And the Germans relied on code books at the beginning of the First World War. These were captured, broken by the British themselves, and the Germans immediately realized the main thing that the First World War taught them was that they shouldn't rely upon easily captured code books. And so in the beginning of the middle of the 1920s, they made the leap to machine-based code-breaking technology.
I found that absolutely fascinating. And this was done, I mean, really from sort of 1920, 22 through 1927. This was during the Weimar Republic. And I mean, I hadn't realized to what extent, even before Hitler, they really were preparing for another conflict, both in terms of intelligence and obviously in terms of actually spending on military hardware.
Yes, they were. A man called Arthur Scherbius invented the Enigma machine originally. It was a telegraphic signal machine that he wanted to sell to commercial businesses like banks who would need a covert way to send messages about transfers of money. And it came to the attention of the German armed forces, and they saw that this might well be something that was there for them, but it was too heavy, it was too expensive to begin with. But thereafter, the Army and the Navy, and lastly the Air Force, adopted it as well, the first prototype of the Enigma machine. Scherbius himself never sadly lived to see the success of his machine, as he died in 1929. He was crushed to death in a horse and carriage accident. And his Enigma machine went on to provide the basis of the coded communications ability for the entire German armed forces, to the extent where hundreds of thousands of them were bought and put into service. And each unit at each level would be equipped with one. At the very height, I think the estimate was something like there are 128,000 Enigma machines in service. Whether this is completely accurate or not, there were certainly thousands upon thousands. And the Germans, relying on this machine, developed it in a very complex way, so that they thought that it was uncrackable. And because at no point, once it was cracked by the Brits and the Americans at Bletchley Park, and with the help of the Poles who were there before them, because the British ability to keep a secret during the entire Second World War meant that the Germans never had evidence in an intercepted British message that the British had information that could only have come from an Enigma encrypted message. The Germans, extraordinarily, were never wise to the successes of their enemies.
Yeah, so that's we know, obviously we know the history of Enigma, and but the thing I'm keen also on is not just Enigma itself, but the intelligence of victories they had coming up into the war. What did they know by the time, what kind of things did they have access to? What kind of things did they know by the time the war had started?
The Germans had done two things before the war started, one of which was to develop the men and technology based upon a series of listening stations across Germany, and also in Spain as well. The Germans were helping Franco in the Spanish Civil War, and they saw it as a very effective arena in which they could perfect their code breaking and code making skills, and their intercept skills too. By the time war broke out, the Germans had made several successful inroads into the coding systems, both of their enemies like the British, and also those of neutral countries as well, such as Turkey and Portugal. The Germans' main target was the British Royal Navy. Britannia ruled the waves. They had a huge navy, and the Germans wanted to know where they were and what they were doing. So from 1936 onwards, the German Navy's code-breaking department, under the auspices of a very capable man called Wilhelm Tranau, who in many ways could be said to be the German Alan Turing. Tranau and his men concentrated on breaking the subtractor systems, as the coding system was known, in the principal Royal Navy cipher code books. And they were partially successful to an extent on these, so that when war broke out, they knew where a large percentage of the Royal Navy's ships were. The Luftwaffe themselves wanted to crack into the RAF code, its bomber code as well. And this they started doing, but they were hamstrung by lack of available signals intelligence that could act as a crib, as it were, a break into the system. These they captured from a crashed Wellington bomber in 1939, where they captured the cards that encrypted messages on the RAF Psycho coding machine. The German Wehrmacht as well had made massive inroads into breaking the codes of the French, particularly, whom they were about to invade, and a number of these successes were based upon either capturing French code books, intercepting French signals by using airborne listening stations over the French border, or in some cases buying or burgling them from French government ministries as well.
The list of the areas in which they had the upper hand, I mean, your book goes through them, and I'm not going to sort of do you credit by trying to get through all of them, but an upper hand in the Battle of the Atlantic, the knowledge about RAF bombing raids, reading messages from embassy traffic, I mean, it's an embarrassing list until Enigma is broken.
Yes, exactly. And the immediate difference, once Enigma was broken, between the British and the Americans, the Allied intelligence effort based on code breaking and the German, became apparent once Enigma was broken. The Allies knew how to keep a secret. The Germans couldn't and didn't, because all of the information had to be circulated to not only the respective heads of the signals intelligence agencies that acted on behalf of the Navy, the Army, the Luftwaffe, the SS, even the German post office had a coded signal system. There were 10 different agencies competing with each other for access to information. Some cases they shared information, some cases they didn't, but all of the intelligence gathered had to go right up the line to Hitler, to Himmler, to Goebbels, to senior Nazi officials, often who didn't believe it or didn't trust it. And whereas the British had complete confidence from their superiors and from those enabling their cryptanalytical successes, and the secrecy aspect of the British, once they'd managed to break Enigma, was staggering. It was the largest difference between them and the Germans.
Yeah, and that I mean, it's I think you were saying also, you know, the difference between having, and if you've got a sort of dictator in charge, is not ready to listen to the advice being given to him. Can you just talk a bit about the cracking, the listening into the US embassy in Cairo and what that led to?
This was a major coup for the Germans and their Italian allies. The Italian military intelligence service burgled the American embassy in Rome before the Americans joined the war. The Americans joined the war. Pearl Harbor was in December 1941. The Italians had quite carefully burgled the military, the defense attache's office at the American embassy in Rome in September 1941, removed from the safe of the defense attaché 2 code books containing the military codes used by defense attachés in American embassies across Europe and the Middle East. The Italians photographed the pages of these books, passed some of them on to their German allies, and then took them back and put the books back in the safe, and the Americans were none the wiser. And the effect that it had was the Germans, again, took these pages of this code book and they broke them back at their headquarters in at Wehrmacht headquarters in Germany. And the effect it had was instantaneous, because at the American embassy in Cairo was a military attaché, a defense attaché called Colonel Bonner Fellers. And Colonel Bonner Fellers was there for a number of reasons, one of which was to assess the extent to which the British forces in the Middle East, the 8th Army, were in need of American military assistance in their fight against the Germans in North Africa. And so every day, Colonel Fellers would go out and see the 8th Army, what they were doing. He'd go and watch them on operations. He'd be updated on their latest equipment, their deployments, their manpower, where they were, who they were with, what they were doing, why they were doing it, and how they were doing it. And he was the perfect source, as in fact Rommel called him. He made copious notes. He was very verbose. He didn't particularly like the British, and he was very keen, to please his superiors. And he would send copious telegrams containing the entire military tactical layout of the British forces in North Africa, several times a week back to Washington. The Germans who'd broken into the codes that he was using were delighted. Rommel said that by lunchtime, if Fellers broadcast something or telegrammed something on a Tuesday afternoon, Rommel would say that by lunchtime the following day, he would know where every tank in the 8th Army was actually standing. And it was remarkably easy for the Germans to do once they'd broken the American embassy, the defense attache's codes. Because what Colonel Fellers did was he would write out his notes, type them out, and then they would be taken to the Egyptian telegram company in Cairo and just transmitted from there in code. And the Germans knew exactly, and this was done day after day after day after day. And it gave Rommel and his men a very significant advantage in knowing where the Eighth Army were going to attack, when and how, when they were going to retreat, the numerical displacement of their tanks. And this went on for 8 months before Fellers was suspected of passing on compromising information. And it was eventually the British who realized that this information had to be coming from somewhere like this. And so he was replaced and the signals were changed.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one example, and the book's great because there's a whole litany of things. And I mean, it's tragic. I mean, the Red Army's locations before Operation Barbarossa, the cracking Romanian codes to get information about the country's oil reserves, helping Franco crack messages for Republicans in the Civil War. I mean, again and again and again and again. And you think, my God, you know, they were really on top of it. And then after the war, there's this scramble to see what the Germans were doing. And some of that is, it's an incredible story in itself, isn't it?
Yes, it's the story of what was called the TICOM intelligence mission, the Tactical Intelligence Committee. As the war was coming to an end, the Allies, particularly the Americans, wanted to know what technological advances the Germans had made during the war that the Allies hadn't. They wanted to know about rockets. They wanted to know about nuclear weapons. They wanted to know about adventures into space. They wanted to know about science, medicine. They particularly wanted to know about codes. And so they sent into Germany and Austria, as the war was coming to an end, team from these intelligence committee went into Germany and to Austria, and their job was very specifically targeted at finding out German personnel who'd worked in cryptanalysis, the machinery they'd used, and the documentation they'd used. And they spread out from right in the north of Germany, above Hamburg, right down to the border with Bavaria and Austria.
But the Germans knew they were coming, so you know, sections like B-Dienst, I don't know if that was still in operation then, were basically doing everything they could to either burn or trash, or in some cases sink their archives of their trove of goods.
Yes, the Velmax OKWII, as it was shortened, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht Chiffresteller, code-breaking department, knowing the end of the war was imminent. They pulled out of Berlin. They were running away like everybody else from the Red Army. They drove south to Bavaria and decided that they would dump dozens and dozens of boxes containing signals apparatus and documents into a deep series of lakes. And they found one, and lo and behold, prompted to empty an awful lot of their archives into this lake. The Americans knew that they'd done it because they captured somebody from a code-breaking unit who said to them, "Oh, by the way, if you're looking for the documents of the Velmax code-breaking operations, they're in, dredge the lake at so-and-so." So the Americans, realizing this was a vast task, started to do so. And they were, as so often happened with code breaking and code making in the Second World War, they were aided and abetted by the human factor, by coincidence, by somebody else's bad luck. An American soldier, while out swimming, drowned sadly in one of these lakes. And so the American army were dredging the lake looking to recover his body. And while they did so, they came across a whole series of rather like in a film, large boxes stamped with the German Nazi eagle lying in the silt at the bottom of the lake.
Mm.
Pulled them all up, and there were part of the archives of the Velmax code-breaking department, the who, the what. And these documents have survived to this day. The documents that I saw, that I based my research on, are the original photocopies and, uploaded and scanned archive copies of the original documents of all of the different German code-breaking departments. It was predominantly an American and British operation. Every single bit of paper they found was saved, translated. They captured a lot of the code breakers as well, naval ones, Luftwaffe ones, and army men. Interrogated them, and some of these interrogation questioning sessions would go on for 2 or 3 years. And the documents that I was looking at when I was doing the research into the book gave you a picture of what it must have been like in those dying days of the Second World War, the first weeks of peace. Typewritten interrogation sessions with German code breakers, where a sergeant, an American Army sergeant, would probably be sitting in a barn somewhere at a table with a typewriter, and in front of him would be a German code breaker being questioned. And I read through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of these of this German documentation that the Americans had made, this sort of record of the German code breaking system that the Americans had made. And a very, very large part of it is technical descriptions of machinery and the German love of describing the administrative setup of any organization. And then suddenly you'll come across a beautiful bit of detail in 2 lines where it will say, Huttenheim and Department 9B had known that the Royal Navy Code 6 was cracked by the Americans with Turkish, background. And then there'll be a sort of side note, and then it drops down to something else. And you have to take these documents and cross-reference all of them to other ones and piece together this huge jigsaw of who was doing what with whom. The answer was, yes, the Germans were looking at the codes of 41 different neutral, hostile, and allied countries to them during the war. But these countries themselves were also cracking into other people's codes too. I mean, when the Germans came to find out what the Greeks were doing before they invaded Greece, they realized there were 2 ways of doing it. They could just go straight and try and crack the Greek naval codes themselves, or it was just actually rather easier just to listen to the Italians. They'd already, unbeknown to the Italians, had cracked all of their codes as well. So they simply decoded the Italian signals because the Italians went to all the effort to break the Greek army codes as well. And other countries, surprise countries, the biggest 2 of which were Turkey and Finland, who were absolute stellar performers. The Finns were very, very, very good cryptanalysts, as were the Turks. And a very good example was right at the end of the war in February 1945, when Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt were attending the Yalta conference.
Pause for a second, because what I want to do is I want to get people start putting their questions in the Q&A box here, so we can start queuing them up. And I'll come to you in just a second. So people can just start tapping away your questions, everyone, in the Q&A box. I'm going to pick on 1 or 2 people I know who've got more knowledge than I have in this realm, and Tim Ripley, who was speaking to us on Tuesday, is one of them. So Tim, I know you're listening in. Tim, I'd love you to put some questions to Christian in just a second. So we'll bring Tim's name up. Just tell us a bit more about Yalta, but also, I mean, I want to know about you talked about the human failures, the fact that you're dealing with an authoritarian regime that doesn't have the ability to recognize mistakes or listen to and correct them. Can you give me an example of that? I think Normandy, it may be one example, but it's also basically about material as well, in basically not having capacity to deal with this.
Yeah, a very good example was on the 7th of June 1944, the day after the Allied landings in Normandy. German troops discovered an abandoned American landing craft in the estuary of the river Wear, which is to the east of Omaha and Utah beaches. In this landing craft at the bottom of it was some American equipment which contained the American code books for the M209 Hagelin encryption device, which paratroopers from the 101st and 82nd Airborne had jumped into Normandy the 36 hours before. This gave, and because the Germans had both in Sicily and in North Africa broken into American codes used on this M209 device, they knew how to break into the codes contained in these code books. However, they didn't have the means at their disposal, aircraft, tanks, men, to react sufficiently quickly or in sufficiently strong force to the intelligence advantage that it gave them. And this was symptomatic of one of the biggest things about code breaking in the Second World War, is the Germans' victories and successes in code breaking were commensurate with tactical and operational and strategic victories, as long as they had the upper hand themselves. When it came to the Russians, it didn't matter what they knew about the enemy in front of them and whether they were advancing or retreating, or whether they had 200,000 men or 300,000 men, if those men were coming straight at you and the Germans were about to retreat. The intelligence was only as good as their tactical and strategic ability to put this intelligence into operational use.
And there are cases on the reverse side that Bletchley Park had the intelligence but they didn't want to give it away, and essentially they were ready to sacrifice lives in order to keep it a secret.
The difficulty for Bletchley Park was that they were terrified of compromising the Enigma goose that kept laying the golden intelligence eggs. And in some cases, they would downplay, even to their own commanders, the usefulness of the intelligence gathered from breaking German messages, rather than betray to the Germans that this information had been gathered by listening to Enigma encoded messages. And we have a picture particularly of Enigma only really being used to any operational effect by the Germans in their submarine battles in the Battle of the Atlantic. But bear in mind that every single operational German armed forces unit was equipped with an Enigma machine, and was sending out messages on it in one of up to a dozen codes. There were 3 separate codes alone, Blunderbuss and Cassian and one other one, that were just used for the movements of Holocaust transports and how the Holocaust was progressing. At the moment, I'm writing another book which is about the Holocaust and the final solution in Italy and how it did or didn't work, basically. And by looking at behind the scenes of encrypted messages from the Swiss, from the Vatican, from the Italians, from the Germans, from the French, all cracked by the British and Americans, you can see what all sides knew about each other as the Holocaust was progressing. So it was in somewhere like Normandy in 1944. But the difficulty was, by then the Germans couldn't take any strategic or operational action against the Allies that was of sufficient strength to have any definitive result at the end of the day.
Great. Well, that's been a really good sort of introductions. We're going to start taking questions from people now. I'll come to Tim Ripley in just a second, but Georg Blaha, you've got a great question. So let's start with you, Georg. Go ahead. Georg?
Sorry, it seems to be stuck. Can you see me, hear me?
I can see you and hear you.
I can see you and hear you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nicholas. Thank you, Christian Jennings. It was very interesting to hear your speech, and I was also buying your ebook this evening and had a look, and I read a lot about World War II. I was completely unaware about the advanced stage of German intelligence. And yesterday, I live in Munich, and yesterday I happened to be hiking around Schliersee and completely unaware about the history you mentioned, of all the boxes dumped there and secretive things going on there. And I was wondering a bit, some intelligence services in World War II, they had really charismatic characters like Ian Fleming from the UK or Richard Zorge from the Soviets based in Tokyo. And I wonder if you are aware of any charismatic German intelligence person who's worth knowing or remembering.
You've got, listen, even before the war starts, you've got to talk about the entrepreneurial businessman who the intelligence operation was sort of farmed out to at the early stages, one of whose ventures was to try and sell bacon to the British.
Yes, this was a German a German character who was Arthur Lohmann, who was in charge of finding different ways of increasing the armed forces capacity of the German armed forces in the 1920s and 1930s, which included some very, 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 on the one hand, some very straightforward ideas like increasing the number of ships and submarines the Germans had. Other ones included trying to undermine the British economy by selling Danish bacon to the British, to undermine the British butchery and pork manufacturing business. Now, in answer to your question, the stars of the German intelligence system were divided into two. There were those who were working for the military arm of intelligence, for the Abwehr, the military intelligence arm of the Velmax, and the Sicherheitsdienste, the SD, which was the intelligence arm of the SS. In the field of cryptanalysis, these men have tended to be much lower key than the more glamorous spies. But people like Wilhelm Tranau, the German leading naval codebreaker, was just as an achiever and just as interesting as Alan Turing was for the British. There were a whole series of German codebreakers whose lives before the war was based on, they were mathematicians, they were logisticians. One of them had been an astronomer. They were understated scientists, and in their own way, even though their personal profiles weren't particularly romantic or glamorous or colourful, their achievements certainly were.
I've got with his book here has got a few of them there, so you can check them out in the book. And Tranau's is this chap down here. I do want to bring in Tim Ripley, because Tim, you've got more expertise in this field than I have. So I mean,
and probably than me.
Yeah, no. If you've got some comments, Tim, or just a few thoughts or a question, do far away. Go ahead, Tim. You have to open your microphone, and maybe you're not there. Maybe.
And here we are. There we are. Yes, I'm here. Right. Okay. One thing I've been quite interested in recently has been. It's not my video. Here we go. Yeah, I'm here. Right here. Yes. One thing I've been quite interested in is Cold War Soviet spies in Britain, and the Cambridge 4 and all the Cambridge spies, all that sort of stuff. And one thing that's quite interesting is that a lot of them were connected to a group of Soviet spies in Switzerland who were instrumental in getting information out of Germany into Switzerland, and then they sent it to Moscow. Some of them were then recycled to become agents in Britain. The famous agent in Oxfordshire who brought out Caius Fuchs's secrets to Moscow. She was linked to this group in Switzerland.
The Lucy ring.
Well, I don't. It was part of that, but they were all very much old Spanish Civil War spies, and then they became involved in Switzerland and all that kind of stuff. But they were rumored to be penetrated by the Germans, and some of their codes were broken by the Germans, and they had to flee, and the Swiss arrested loads of them. Did you pick up anything about how much the Germans knew about these Soviet spies in Switzerland, and whether the British and Americans found out anything about them from breaking into the German records?
Tim, that's a very academic question. You're putting...
but it's all about how it's whether, it gets to the heart of whether these intelligence agencies knew what each other were doing, and were they operating in vacuums, or were they, once you broke one agency, could you break into another? And it's a sort of the Cold War spy stuff. How much did we really know about what these spies were doing until it was too late?
And I guess the other question is, Tim, that if they did find out, I mean, would they let anyone know that they did know, and hence they should have known a lot earlier, and there was a huge cock up?
Well, it comes back another way, because of course the British intelligence was penetrated by Kim Philby and all the Cambridge spies, who were hiding away incriminating information to try and throw the British counterintelligence off their trail. So it becomes double games within double games of spy organizations.
Christian, have you got anything on that?
Yes, there's a chapter in the book about the Swiss angle of it all. The answer is everybody knew a little bit about what each other was doing. The Germans suspected that a group of Germans, group of Russians, group of Swiss based inside Switzerland were sending information to the Soviets about German troop deployments, particularly in the run-up to the Battle of Operation Citadel, the crucial Battle of Kursk in 1943. The Germans knew about the activities of these people, and the Abwehr, particularly the German Wehrmacht, the German army intelligence, had been tracking them, trying to find out what they were doing and who they were. The Swiss knew about them as well, and Swiss intelligence were passing information about them both to the British and to the Germans too. The Swiss themselves had a chink in their cryptanalytical armor, because they were sending information on a Swiss civilian version of the Enigma machine, which the British and the Americans and the Germans had all cracked. It was a much more simple version than the German military Enigma machine. The Russians themselves knew all about this, because it was John Cairncross, was one of the Cambridge spies, was working at Bletchley Park on the Luftwaffe coded signals decryption desk, and he managed to tip off the Russians about the forthcoming Battle of Kursk. However, straightforward German signals intercepts done by the British at Bletchley had already discovered what the German intentions were at Kursk, and Churchill, to hide the source of the ultra information, had managed to get this information to the Russians without letting on that it came from Enigma. The answer to your question, Tim, is the Lucy ring of Russian-oriented spies in Switzerland were made up of Russian sympathizers, German, Swiss, and Russians themselves, and one Spaniard, as I remember. The Swiss knew about them, the British knew about them, the Germans knew about them, and the Russians knew about them. The Germans probably knew more about them than anybody else, because they had at least two people who were giving them information, one paid, and the other one was because they got into the Swiss Enigma machine first and fastest.
Right. Okay. I'm going to do come back in a second, Tim, but let's take a question from Paul Jackson. Paul, go ahead, please. If you just your microphone, go on. Yeah.
Hello. Excellent so far. Thank you. Excellent. I just wondered, I've just been reading an excellent book called The Citizens of London, which is the American version of the Americans keeping out of the war and what went on and everything. Did the Americans spy on us? Did we spy on them?
Sorry, say again. Did the Americans spy on?
Did we spy on the Americans? Did the Americans spy on us?
The Americans were listening to, well, Bletchley Park and Arlington Hall in the United States both had access to all of the same captured German signals and intercepted German signals information. So the British and the Americans simultaneously would know what information there was about their enemies simultaneously. So it was very hard for either side to camouflage anything from the other. After the war, it transpired that, of course, the Americans were, like everybody else, trying to get as much information and intelligence from everybody else as possible. And for instance, the Americans were running cryptanalytical sources from the Finns, where the Americans were getting information about Japanese intentions, because the Japanese defense attaché in Helsinki would tell Finnish intelligence what the Japanese plans were, or the Finns were cracking the Japanese codes as well. And they were selling this information to the Americans so they could buy weapons, for instance. The Americans were doing a lot of stuff that they didn't necessarily tell the British about all the time, and vice versa. Were we and the Americans spying on each other? Yes, we were, but I wouldn't say it was spying. I think both sides were listening to the signals sent by each other as a matter of absolutely routine course. But I don't think predominantly either side would not have been informed about this, because the communality of strategic and operational and tactical aims and objectives of the Allies, between the cohesion between Roosevelt and Churchill was such that, and it was such a top-up way of running things. They would have been appalled if there'd been any more than low-scale covert activity that either side didn't know about. And what was happening was that the British and the Americans together, the German post office had invented a device for de-scrambling, the scrambling machine that was used to encrypt the conversations between British and American leaders that were transferred on the underground, on the undersea telephone telegraph link. And the Germans had cracked this, de-scrambled this. And there are several notable references from German intelligence chiefs, from Walter Schellenberg, the head of the SD, the SS's Foreign Intelligence Service at one point, where he said that he'd been told that they'd heard Roosevelt and Churchill talking before the landings in Sicily and talking before the landings in Normandy. Despite such a sort of intelligence coup, it still didn't bring the Germans any closer at all to knowing at all where the British and Americans and the Canadians were going to land in Normandy on the 6th of June.
Yeah, amazing. Tim, I'm going to come back to you in just a second, Tim Ripley. But Christian, before we do that, there's this great bit in the book when you talk about during the First World War, the Germans know that their codes have been broken, that numerous code books have been taken by, maybe I've got this the wrong way around, and that nothing is done about it, and they continue to stick with the same code books. Is there any sense in the Second World War that the Germans know that their codes have been broken, but there's nothing they can do?
They knew that Enigma had been compromised and that it was possible to break messages sent encoded with an Enigma code, because the Polish army officers and signals technicians who'd invented it told them when they were captured at the beginning of the war on their way to Czechoslovakia. But the people that the Poles told weren't in a high enough position to understand the importance of it. By later on in the war, when the Germans were suspicious that Enigma had been compromised, their way of dealing with it was just to increase the security capacity of each Enigma machine in question by putting another rotor on it, or increasing the number of times the rotor settings were changed, per day or per 2 day in each 2-day period. What they weren't aware of, which was extraordinary, which was the extent to which the Allies were listening to the U-boats, Enigma messages, codenamed Shark was just one of them. And although the Allies, yes, certainly, if one of the great stories of Bletchley Park is how they cracked the U-boats codes and therefore could listen to what they were doing in the Battle of the Atlantic, enabling them to pinpoint the U-boats before they attacked convoys. Yes, they could do to a certain extent, but there was the central focal period of the Battle of the Atlantic in beginning of 42 to beginning of 43. For large portions of this, Bletchley Park, by its own admittance, and by the admittance of an internal Royal Navy assessment report written after the war, the British Royal Navy was blind to Shark. It was blind to Enigma encoded in messages for much of that period. And in the book, there's a part of it where I recreate an attack by a U-boat on a convoy, starting with an attack on a Canadian destroyer. And I recreate the attack through the coded signals sent by the U-boat, which were then decrypted by Bletchley. The Germans knew where the convoy was because their naval intelligence cryptanalytical service was reading the convoy's codes and the convoy escorts codes. It was only during the middle of the Battle of the Atlantic that the captain of this Canadian destroyer, the Ottawa, which was sunk, was told afterwards on arrival on dry land, when he was debriefed, he was told by a senior British naval officer that, by the way, the Germans knew you were coming. We know that they've been reading our codes and know where our ships and our convoys are before they leave New York or Liverpool. And as the Canadian destroyer captain said, he was furious about this, and he wrote all of this down before he died. It was the last thing he wrote in his life. And he said he really, really, really would love to have known that before his ship was sunk, not after it.
But it's a great book. I know that it's possible to, when from the sound of our conversation, sometimes it's above my head and the detail sounds quite specific. But what I really admire is that there's this huge weight of history books written in the US, written in the UK about the Second World War, and they all dwell on our side of the story. If you go to Germany, there's not much written about, there's not nearly as much, written about it. And this is a book that takes a different angle. So it's great from that perspective. We've got time for a few more questions now, but I've got Simon Jackson and then Stuart Williams. But Tim, can I bring you back in just for another comment? Go ahead, Tim.
One of the things that made Bletchley Park such a success was not just the reading the codes. It's what they called traffic analysis, the direction finding operation that pinpointed where all these radio signals came from, so you could pinpoint the location of where the signal was transmitted from, and then also the making up the sort of the directory of the German armed forces from these locations and combining it with a radio so you could work out where they were coming from, where they were moving, all that sort of stuff. And that became a massive bureaucratic exercise of building up the order of battle of the German armed forces at an encyclopedic level. Was there an equivalent on the German side that was able to pinpoint the physical location for the radio track? Because the codes, often it took days to decrypt all these codes, but if you had location, you got a head start on where the U-boats were, for example. The Germans had the same
briefly
sort
on
of
that one, because I need to bring in a couple of other questions
Yeah.
before we go. So briefly on that one, Christian.
Very quickly, yes, the Luftwaffe, as Tim said, they weren't just they weren't just cracking and breaking codes, they were intercepting radio traffic. The Luftwaffe radio intercept unit based in northern France before D-Day had, by taking and intercepting the signals sent by every single British fighter and bomber and troop transport squadron in southern England, built up a very, very, very cohesive and comprehensive picture of where two Allied air armies were based across southern and central England prior to D-Day. And when these squadrons sent out signals that they were starting to move or going into radio lockdown or being deployed or taking off or whatever, the Luftwaffe knew something was coming. But as Tim said, they had built up a configurative atlas of Allied units just by intercepting their code, but also by triangulating where these radio signals all came from. It was just one small example of them doing what the Allies were doing.
Yeah, I mean, you say quite early on in the book they'd already very clear where ships were coming and moving well before the war in terms of where they were going in ports and their shipping routes. Let's bring in Simon Jackson for a question, and then Stuart Williams. So go ahead, Simon. We've got more questions coming through. So Simon Jackson, please go ahead.
Did the German cryptographers have any mechanical tools equivalent to Turing's early computer?
They tended to rely on people rather than massive computerized machinery. And one of the ways they did it was by farming it out to large amounts. They had a lot of what one might call subservient manpower, although they were always complaining they didn't have enough people to go through all the intercepted Allied signals. The answer to your question is no, they didn't have a large early computerized system, prototype system like the Allies did, but they did use smaller versions of it on occasions, but much more so they relied on people.
Okay, a good question there, Simon. Suji's got a good question. We'll go for Sue next.
Hi, that was really interesting. I'm curious, you mentioned the Finns sold Japanese intelligence to the Americans. I'm just wondering, did the Germans or the Europeans or the US or Americans, how much Japanese intelligence were they monitoring? Because, you know, for those of us in Asia, World War II was more about what happened with Japan, of course. So I'm just wondering in what you did, your research, what you came up with.
Good question, Sue. And I think there's an interesting answer here, Christian.
One of the main sources of Japanese intelligence came from the Japanese ambassador in Berlin, who was had very close relations with von Ribbentrop, foreign minister, but also with Hitler. And throughout his time in Berlin, up until 1944, would tell Hitler quite comprehensive details and operational strategic plans of what the Japanese were doing in the Pacific, in return for which Hitler would tell him about what he was going to do in Normandy and what he was going to do and what he was doing in Russia. The Americans had broken the one of the primary Japanese codes, which they codenamed Purple, and the Americans knew, both through direct intercepts of Japanese signals in the Pacific, but also through messages from Japanese embassies in Europe, back to Japan, what the Japanese themselves were intending to do, and also what the Japanese had learned from the Americans. So the Americans, quite often in some cases, you read interviews with American cryptanalytical staff on the eastern seaboard of the United States, who were reading decrypted Japanese signals from Berlin before they'd even got to Tokyo as well. Because the telegraphic and signals transfer from Germany out to Japan could be quite slow because of bombing raids both ends.
So the answer is a huge trove, isn't it? In terms of traffic between the Germans and the Japanese was a huge source of intelligence.
Yes, exactly. There was a whole separate American installation sort of aimed at cracking the Japanese codes as well, and the Russians were listening to the Japanese as well, and as both the Turks and the Germans were listening into Russian codes, this was another way the Germans found out about it as well.
We're running out of time here, and I'm a couple more questions here. I've got Stuart Williams, who's got a very left field question here, Stuart. I think if you're still there, I don't know if Stuart is up. I will ask Stuart's question for him. He says, does the European Union conduct espionage other than by its members? And this is clearly not your area of expertise or Tim's, but if either of you have got a comment on that, do say.
Does the European Union?
I think the EU has got a foreign policy body, and I think the question is, does it have an espionage body? And I think that's probably I've put the question out there. If you've got an answer, say so. But otherwise, I think we'll move on.
The nations of the sorry.
It's for Tim. This one.
Okay. The nations of the EU have intelligence bodies, but the EU organization headquarters has a body that analyzes the information given to it by the nations. I don't think they actually collect it themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
And what's that body called?
Well, it's the European Foreign and Defence Policy. They've got their what's the name? It's a member of the Commission that runs all the EU military missions.
Yeah,
they have a staff that gets the information.
So we were able to answer the question. I'm very impressed. I'm very impressed.
Yes.
Now, we've got a question from Dave here, who's a colleague of ours, and he says, and it's a really good question too. He said, to what extent was this an all-male affair? It's dominated by men. All the characters have been talking about men, and were women sort of relegated to the role of Mata Haris, that kind of thing? Or obviously there were some key spies out there, but in terms of the actual apparatus, the cryptology, we know that in Bletchley Park there were women decrypting codes. What about on the German side of things, Christian?
The Germans had exactly the same arrangement as at Bletchley Park. They employed huge numbers of women, many of them in quite senior positions. And when you read interviews with German Army and Navy and Air Force code breakers from the beginning of the war, they didn't mind who they employed, so long as the personnel were qualified. The Germans employed large numbers of women, and in fact one of their lead code breakers, Ursula Hagen, was a very technically proficient woman who concentrated on breaking the diplomatic codes of neutral countries such as Ireland and Portugal and Sweden, which she did in a heartbeat. She was a brilliant mathematician.
Great. Well, listen, I think we're going to wrap it up there, everyone. I'm going to hold Christian's book up here again. So it is called The Third Reich is Listening, and it is a good read. If for those of you not military boffins, it is actually, you will get through it pretty quickly. It's good fun. We have got a packed rest of the month and March ahead of us. So we're going to say thank you to Christian. Also, thank you to Tim. Please do stay on the line, everyone. If Tim and Christian can stay on just for a bit afterwards, we have a more informal conversation after this hour section. So do stay on if you can. So my thanks to Christian Jennings and also to Tim Ripley.